In a small southern town in America, where a sign reading Freedom and Equality hangs right next to the Confederate flag, what seemed like a peaceful morning marked the start of a social storm. Marley James, an eighth-grade black student, was well known as one of the brightest and most spirited students at Oak Ridge Middle School. With her signature braided pigtails and a copy of Black Women Who Changed America always in her backpack, Marley wasn't just academically gifted, she was a vocal advocate for justice in her community. But on that fateful day, Marley's confidence was challenged not by a test or a math quiz, but by a man. Officer Patrick Boyle, a white police officer with a long record of unjustified stops involving students of color in the school district. As Marley passed through the school gates, smiling with her friends and getting ready for class, she had no idea that within minutes, her braids and her skin color would be used as evidence against her in an unprecedented incident. And just like that, a routine school morning turned Marley into the central figure of a very public fight against prejudice, unchecked authority, and the long silence of an educational and legal system built to overlook kids who look like her. Greystone, Missouri, a town where porch flags stay up year-round, and Liberty High School proudly boasts the slogan, "Where every student is free to thrive as long as you're not too free." Some mornings begin with bird song, gentle sunlight, and the readiness to conquer the world. But for Marley James, an 11th grader and captain of the debate team, that morning began with a spontaneous inspection courtesy of Officer Patrick Boyle, who fancied himself the all-seeing guardian of peace on campus. Marley, a 16-year-old black girl, intelligent and sharp-witted, with neatly braided shoulder-length hair, wearing a perfectly standard uniform and carrying a backpack that complied with the Department of Education's regulations. In other words, there was absolutely no reason to suspect her except that Marley wasn't white. As soon as she stepped through the school gates, Marley was stopped by Officer Boyle, who once detained a student for walking too fast in the hallway with a professional frown etched into his face. Boyle: "Excuse me, but I see signs of non-compliance." Marley, raising an eyebrow: "I haven't said anything." Boyle, gravely: "Exactly. Silence is also a form of passive resistance. At Liberty High, freedom of speech is a flexible concept, meaning you're only allowed to speak if your words don't make anyone uncomfortable, especially those with badges and unspoken insecurities about students of color." Boyle demanded that Marley open her backpack, though he had no clear reason. When Marley asked why, he replied vaguely, "Because you've got an attitude." That morning, Marley had only wanted to make it to math class on time. But fate and an officer with nothing better to do pushed her into a social studies lesson far tougher than any SAT exam. Marley stood in the middle of the schoolyard, back straight, eyes fixed on Officer Patrick Boyle, with a look of patience mixed with disbelief. She had violated no rules, hadn't spoken a word, hadn't even had a chance to check in for attendance, yet she was being interrogated as though she had just smuggled contraband in her lunchbox. Boyle, with that cold stare so accustomed to jumping to conclusions, blocked her path, one hand resting on his duty belt, a pose he frequently struck when trying to assert authority over black students, yet still by the book enough to avoid lawsuits. "Open your backpack," he said, his voice loud enough for a few students nearby to turn and look. Marley gave a soft chuckle, not because it was funny, but because she had seen this exact scene in movies too many times. Only this time, she'd been cast as the main character. "Sir," she said, trying to keep her voice even, "can you tell me why, exactly?" Boyle raised an eyebrow, as if the question itself were a personal insult. "Attitude," he replied. "You just looked at me disrespectfully." The students nearby began to murmur. A few discreetly pulled out their phones to record. In that very moment, a white student, Jake, walked onto campus with a torn backpack and a soda can sticking out of the side pocket. Boyle glanced at him, but didn't blink. No backpack check, no questions, no suspicion. Only Marley triggered his concern. Maybe her backpack was too intact. Or maybe her skin tone didn't fit the safe color palette Boyle had built in his mind. Marley, instead of getting angry, simply unzipped her backpack in silence. Inside were textbooks, notebooks, and a half-read Toni Morrison novel. Nothing out of the ordinary. Boyle leaned in, inspecting the contents with the severity of someone defusing a bomb. Seems clear for now, he muttered, then gave a slight nod to signal she could go. Marley walked away, not angry, just feeling. She felt a quiet stillness inside, because she knew that for some people in that uniform, her mere presence was already an excuse. She didn't need to do anything wrong, just existing was enough to be seen as a threat. But what Boyle didn't know was that this 16-year-old girl wasn't just smart and calm, she also knew how to make the world stop and look. And this time, Marley had no intention of letting it go. Marley walked into class, eyes trailing her, half curious, half worried. She hadn't even had a chance to sit down when the door slammed open, making the whole class jump. Officer Boyle walked in again, not to check a backpack this time, but for a conversation with students about behavior and conduct on campus. Mr. Mendez, the homeroom teacher, forced a polite smile. Mr. Mendez, Officer Boyle has a few minutes to share with you all about school safety. Please listen carefully. Boyle stepped up to the front like he was investigating a national homicide case. He scanned the room, then his eyes stopped right on where Marley was sitting. Officer Boyle, school safety starts with attitude. Attitude is one of the easiest things to detect, even when you don't say a word. A glance at the wrong time, a lack of cooperation, or a challenging look. Marley raised her head and looked him straight in the eye, not defiantly, but clearly and consciously. Marley, sir, what kind of look is considered safe? Because this morning I was just looking at someone who was looking at me. The whole room fell silent. Someone stifled a cough to hide a chuckle. Boyle pressed his lips together. Officer Boyle, what I mean is respectful attitude. You should learn to lower your gaze when speaking to elders, especially those in uniform. Marley, yes, but if respect means looking down, then isn't that respect only meant for some people and not for people like me? The air in the classroom suddenly thickened, as if someone had turned off the fan. Officer Boyle, young lady, now you're being dramatic. This has nothing to do with race. Marley, smiling, no, sir. This is about a look, and sometimes someone's gaze says more than their words ever could. Mr. Mendez quickly interjected, his voice light like a breeze. Mr. Mendez, perhaps we should let Officer Boyle continue with his talk. But Boyle had already gone silent. He stood still for a few seconds, as if suddenly pulled out of his comfortable seat of authority. For the first time, he had no words to say, because it's hard to give a speech about respect when your very presence is the loudest accusation in the room. Class ended. The bell rang like a rusty factory shift buzzer, only today. No one rushed out. Everyone stayed, as if something important had just begun, but hadn't been named yet. Marley packed her books slowly. She could feel the unusual stares, some admiring, some sympathetic, and some cautious, like she had done something either too brave or too dangerous. Out in the hallway, Officer Boyle stood next to the water fountain, still clutching his briefcase like it held national security secrets. When he saw Marley, he straightened his back, trying to regain control. Officer Boyle. Girl, you think you're clever, don't you? Marley, gently. No, sir. I just think I have the right to ask. Officer Boyle, restrained tone. Questions asked in the wrong place can cause problems. Marley paused, then spoke slowly, her voice not loud, but as clear as chalk writing across a blackboard. Marley, then, is the problem the question or the answer nobody dares to face? Right at that moment, Mr. Mendez happened to walk by. Though he clearly sensed the tension in the air, he didn't step in. Instead, he stood by the water fountain, poured himself a cup, then turned and smiled at Marley, as if he had just witnessed a quiet anthem echo through the schoolyard. Mr. Mendez. Good question, Marley. Sometimes the only thing stopping the truth from being buried is a kid brave enough to ask. Boyle looked at both of them, his face pale with anger, but he couldn't do anything. Every threat he made would only make him seem more like someone cornered by the shadow of his own actions. Marley walked away, neither rushing nor proud. But every step she took echoed down the hallway the sound of a change being planted. As for Officer Boyle, he stood there. For the first time in his life, he realized sometimes power isn't stolen. It melts away when faced with the truth, especially when it's spoken by a 16-year-old girl with braids and eyes that never know how to look down. The next day, there was a strange energy in the school. News of the conversation between Marley and Officer Boyle spread faster than the clip of the gym teacher's tumble from last week. Everyone was talking about it, whispering in the cafeteria, passing notes in the bathrooms, and even the choir group had incorporated Marley's name into their Wednesday practice song. However, the only person who didn't find any joy in it was Boyle. His breakfast, a turkey sandwich with a little too much pride sprinkled on top, got stuck in his throat when he saw a group of students stick note papers on the lockers. Asking is a right, not a crime. Stop doubting. Start answering. Meanwhile, Marley continued her life as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew that, since yesterday, she had stepped out of her role as the quiet good student. Now she was a symbol of something that made adults sweat. Bluntness presented with grace that couldn't be faulted. At lunch, when Boyle walked through the basketball court, his usual domain, where every student bowed their heads, he suddenly heard a shout from somewhere. Hey, don't forget, racism isn't a policy, it's a sickness. The students burst into laughter. Boyle spun around, his eyes scanning the crowd like an X-ray, but no one lowered their head anymore. No more fearful glances, just teasing smiles, defiant looks. For the first time in his career, Boyle felt like he wasn't the one patrolling, but the one being watched. Marley sat further off, under the shade of a tree, pretending to be engrossed in her book, but the corner of her mouth curved upward. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need a slogan. She just needed to plant one question. And the truth had already found its way to grow. As for Boyle, he started to realize that the badge around his neck no longer protected him from sharp questions, especially when they came from a 14-year-old girl with a mind that refused to bow and eyes that knew when to place a question mark. That afternoon in the school cafeteria, there was an odd sound, silence. Not because the food was worse than usual, though the sandwich today was indeed a crime, but because Officer Boyle stood in the middle of the room, holding a plastic tray, his eyes darting around as if he was hunting. But no one lowered their heads to avoid him. There were no awkward stares or tight lips. Now, from the lunch tables where students used to shy away, there were eyes watching him calmly, sometimes even a little amused. Marley sat at the back table, just like every day, but with a completely different vibe. Beside her was Jamal, the student who wrote poetry about justice. There was Linda, the girl who had been stopped and questioned for walking suspiciously in the hallway. And Samira, the one who was once questioned just for wearing a beanie for too long in the library. They weren't talking about math. They weren't discussing exams. They were talking about writing a petition requesting the school to review the powers of security staff on campus. Jamal was planning to add a poem at the end of the petition, while Samira insisted on including the line, "Respecting students isn't optional, it's a condition." From a distance, Boyle saw this scene. And what bothered him the most wasn't the petition. It was Marley's calmness. She didn't look at him like an enemy. She simply looked through him, as though he were an old book with words that had gone out of date. He walked over to their table, set down his tray, and tried to assert his authority with a deep voice. "I heard you're planning to file a complaint about my duties." Marley looked up, as polite as a lawyer in her first debate. "We just want to make sure that power isn't confused with privilege, officer." Linda nodded. "And we think suspicion shouldn't be the main reason someone is treated like a criminal on school grounds," Jamal emphasized, "especially when suspicion usually only arises when a student shares the same skin tone as coffee." No one laughed. No one shouted. But the entire room could hear it. Boyle clenched his fists but couldn't retort, because every word he had became clumsy in the face of these students' calmness. Students he had thought would just quiet down if threatened. He stood up and walked away. The plastic tray on the table still had half a sandwich left, but the authority on his shoulders, something he had once believed to be inviolable, had fallen apart piece by piece, quietly and without a sound. On Tuesday morning, the hallway of Franklin High School was no longer filled with hasty footsteps or the clanging of bells. Today, it was a stage. Not for fashion, but for resistance, silent but clear. All the students of color in the school, and a few very understanding white students, wore knit hats. Not because it was cold. The sun was hot that day, but because 1 week ago, Samira had been asked to take off her hat because it looked suspicious. Today, the knit hat was a symbol, a way of saying, "We see, we remember, and we won't stay silent anymore." Officer Boyle, as usual, stood waiting at the end of the hallway, his arms crossed in front of him, his eyes scanning like a radar, searching for dangerous behavior. But today, his radar was off. Too many hats. Too many indifferent stares passing by, as if he was just an old news column someone had forgotten to clean up. Jamal walked past, giving a slight nod. "Good morning, officer. That knit hat goes well with the jacket, doesn't it?" Boyle furrowed his brows. "These tricks are not in the rule book." Marley, who followed right behind, stopped, flashing a charming smile that left him flustered. "We're just expressing ourselves. Just like the school policy that encourages students to express themselves positively and non-violently." Boyle stammered. Linda, from behind, added, "Also, we'd be happy to discuss why normal behavior becomes suspicious when the person doing it is a student of color. No shouting, no pushing, just politeness, sharpness, and determination." And that's what made Boyle feel small. No longer the one in power, but the one trying to cling to a fragile authority that felt as thin as a disciplinary slip. He turned and walked away without saying anything further. And from behind him, Samira's voice rang out, soft as a breath, but as sharp as a hammer of justice. "You can take the hats off our heads, but you won't take the awareness out of our heads." A few students chuckled quietly. No one was scared anymore. No longer did they feel the need to bow their heads when seeing a shiny silver badge. Because now, the knit hat, the very thing that had been deemed suspicious, had become a symbol of awareness, subtlety, and resilience. That day, Principal Gonzalez walked into the surveillance room with a face as heavy as an unsigned disciplinary report. She had a USB in her hand. No one asked anything. She placed it on the table in front of Officer Boyle and spoke briefly and decisively, as though commanding the weather. I reviewed the footage from the east hallway. 9:42 a.m. The day Samira was stopped. Boyle raised an eyebrow, but still tried to maintain the "I have no idea what you're talking about" demeanor. Principal Gonzalez opened the computer. A video appeared, clear and undeniable. Samira walked by, wearing a light gray hoodie, not doing anything except going to school. At the same time, another group of white students, also wearing knit hats, walked by in the same direction. No one was stopped. No one was questioned. The video paused at the moment when Boyle stepped in front of Samira, pointing at her hat, his face scrunched up as if she'd hidden a grenade in her jacket pocket. The principal didn't say anything else. She just looked at him. Her gaze wasn't harsh, wasn't angry. It was just disappointed. The kind of disappointment that only those who have truly trusted can express. "So, how do you explain this, officer?" Boyle smiled weakly, but it was a smile that felt as unstable as a three-legged chair. "Maybe I misjudged the situation, but it's because I have to stay alert. So white students don't need to be on alert." Her voice remained light, but not soft. Boyle tried to respond, but then he realized, with the undeniable evidence and the faces of those watching through the glass, he had nothing left to hold on to. Just then, Jason, a student on the school board, walked into the room, holding an external hard drive. I extracted more from a different camera angle. "It has audio," he said. "This looks like a familiar dangerous type." "What did that mean, officer?" The air in the room suddenly chilled by a few degrees. Boyle swallowed. His heart raced as if he were asking for early retirement. Principal Gonzalez looked at Jason, nodded, "Thank you." Perfect timing. Then, turning back, she spoke clearly, word by word. "I will submit all of this evidence to the District Education Board and the Internal Affairs Department. This is not just an issue of school policy. It's a clear and systemic case of discrimination." Boyle remained silent. For the first time in many years, the badge on his chest was no longer a shield. It had become evidence. In that room, no one shouted. No one needed to pound the table. There was only the truth, and a silence that could not be denied. And when the principal left, the USB remained there like a knock on the closed door of abuse of power. And this time, it would not close again. The next day, the entire school was buzzing. The news of the video spread faster than the iPhone discount sales. On the student internal network, the clip was shared with the caption, "When you just want to study math, but end up starring in a racial discrimination drama." Samira walked down the hallway, and this time no one dared to stop her. But not because they were afraid, because they knew she had become a symbol. Not the kind of symbol like the friendly student, but the kind of symbol that says, "If you don't sit down, this girl will bring the whole table over to make you look." She didn't speak, didn't shout. Instead, she posted a message on the school forum. "I don't need to shout to be heard. I just need you to look at the truth and ask yourselves, if I were white, would this have happened?" The post garnered hundreds of replies. Jason, who had quietly helped her, now posted a photo of the hard drive with the hashtag #JusticeForSamira. Equal hoodies, equal rights. Even the vice principal, who had once reprimanded her for sitting too freely in English class, sent an apology email. One sentence. Very short. But it was the first time he admitted, "Maybe I misjudged." Samira didn't need to retaliate. She just needed everyone to remember. This happened. And she, a black girl, stood up, even when no one had her back at first. A week later, the district education board held an emergency meeting. Officer Boyle was suspended while awaiting an internal investigation. Meanwhile, Principal Gonzalez was given the authority to overhaul the security check procedures at the school. And the first thing she did? She abolished the rule, no hats in school, unless it's a backward baseball cap worn during a presentation about hip-hop history. Admittedly, Jason's idea was rather timely, but there was a more important change. An independent oversight committee was established, with students involved. And Samira, despite only being in the 9th grade, was invited to serve as an honorary advisor. At the first meeting, when a parent objected to empowering students, Samira smiled and said, "We don't need power. We just need to be treated like normal people, not judged by our skin color or the hats we wear." The room fell silent. The officer temporarily replacing Boyle, an Asian American named Chang, stepped up to say a brief sentence. "I was once followed when I walked into a grocery store at 14. I understand. And I'm here to make sure this never happens to any student again." The room erupted in applause. It's strange how a hoodie, something meant to block the wind and cover ears, could become a cause for discrimination. But the good news is that very hoodie, when worn by a girl like Samira, became a symbol of courage, of self-respect, and of standing firm in the face of prejudice. This story didn't end with someone being fired or disciplined. It ended with a system having to look at itself and learn how to listen to those who had been deemed insignificant. If you're still listening, thank you for staying. And if you've ever been dismissed simply for being yourself, remember, you're not alone. And sometimes, a girl in a hoodie going to school is the one who makes an entire system learn a lesson.